She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She didn't even raise her voice. Standing beside her car in a church parking lot holding only her keys and her name, she was treated like a threat because to them, presence without apology was provocation. They didn't ask who she was, they just acted. Handcuffs, accusations, eyes that looked through her. But behind her stillness was a different kind of strength. She made one phone call, not in panic but with purpose, and within minutes the ground began to shift. What they thought was a quiet arrest became a national mirror. This story isn't just about her. It's about what we choose to see and what we pretend not to. Where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are right now? It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when Dr. Lenora Grant stepped out of St. James Chapel, her heels tapping gently on the cracked concrete walkway that ran alongside the church's brick wall still warm from the sun. The air carried the faint echo of bells from a nearby tower ringing slowly like a breath being held too long. She adjusted the strap of her navy blue handbag over her shoulder, smiling politely at an elderly deacon who'd thanked her for the outreach lecture she'd just given about post-surgical home care in underserved communities. Children played on the patchy grass beside the parking lot, their laughter trailing off into the breeze. As Lenora scanned the lot for her car, a deep gray Lexus parked under the shadow of a sycamore tree. Her floral dress caught the wind just slightly as she walked, revealing the steady poise of someone used to standing still under pressure. In her right hand, she held a worn leather folder. Inside were printouts from her slides, annotated with patient outcomes and staffing recommendations she planned to email Monday morning. Her steps were even calm, but her thoughts moved in quieter, more guarded directions. These kinds of events, even in church, required a kind of emotional calculus she'd practiced for years. How to smile enough to be seen as warm, but not so much to be seen as vulnerable. How to be gracious without inviting familiarity that might later turn hostile. She was nearly at her car when she noticed the woman. Mid-50s, pale pink blouse, crisp white slacks, oversized sunglasses, despite the dappled shade. She stood near a silver SUV, keys in hand, pretending to check her trunk while glancing at Lenora with a kind of practiced unease. Lenora didn't flinch, didn't slow. She simply opened her door and placed her bag in the passenger seat, aware as always of every eye that lingered too long. "Excuse me," the woman called out, her voice high-pitched and tight, as if trying to sound both polite and alert at once. "Are you here with someone?" Lenora straightened slowly, turned to face her without crossing the distance between them. "No," she said simply, not unkindly. "I gave a presentation earlier. I'm heading out now." There was a pause. Not long, but long enough to register. The woman nodded, once said nothing more, and pulled out her phone. Lenora didn't have to see the screen to know what she was doing. It wasn't the first time. Back in the driver's seat, Lenora sat for a moment with her door ajar, the edge of her dress caught beneath her. She looked down at her hands, strong, steady, the same hands that had held scalpels over, opened skulls and reset fragile spines under blinding white lights, and flexed her fingers unconsciously like a pianist preparing to play. For years, she'd been told her success would shield her, that if she just earned the degrees, wore the white coat, stayed composed, she could move through the world protected. But the truth was quieter and crueler. No matter how many letters followed her name, someone would still call the police because she was sitting in a car they thought was too nice for her to drive. She exhaled through her nose, started the engine and reached for the seatbelt, but something made her pause. In the corner of her eye, she saw the patrol car turn into the lot, slowly, not rushing, like they already believed there was no emergency, just something to check. Lenora stayed seated. She knew what would happen if she drove off now, even though she had every right to. It would escalate. They'd follow. Claim she was evading. That story never ended well. Instead, she pulled out her phone and texted 2 words to a contact saved under a name that looked innocuous to anyone watching. "It's time." The car doors clicked open before she even finished placing her phone back in the console. 2 officers emerged, both white, one built like a high school linebacker who never stopped reliving the glory days, the other younger, thinner, jittery. Their uniforms looked fresh, pressed, too clean for comfort. The older one approached first, a fake smile stretched thin across his face. "Afternoon, ma'am. Mind stepping out of the vehicle for a moment?" Lenora didn't move yet. "Is there a reason, officer?" "We got a call about a suspicious individual in the lot," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the church behind him. "We just want to ask a few questions." "Standard stuff. I just gave a medical lecture inside the chapel," she replied evenly. "I'm Dr. Lenora Grant. I was invited." "That's so." His tone wasn't aggressive, not yet, just dripping with disbelief. The younger one stood off to the side, eyes bouncing from her to the car, then back to his partner, clearly unsure if this was how things were supposed to go. "I have my ID," Lenora said, already reaching slowly for her bag again, every motion deliberate, rehearsed. "Would you like to see it?" "Actually," the older cop said, cutting her off, "I'd prefer if you step out first." The breeze picked up just a little. Birds chattered in the trees overhead. From inside the chapel, the sound of an organ warmed up in long humming chords. Lenora stepped out, carefully, slowly. Her shoes clicked against the pavement. She stood tall, the sun touching her cheekbones, her spine straight as glass. This was the beginning of something. She could feel it like the pressure in the air before a storm, silent but undeniable. She looked the officer in the eye, and for the first time in a long time she felt that old question rise up again from the quiet center of her chest. What do they see when they look at me? Because no matter how much she accomplished, it never seemed to be enough to answer it. The sound of footsteps grew louder, as the officers approached, gravel shifting beneath their boots like a warning disguised as routine. Lenora watched them out of the corner of her eye, her posture still, but alert, as if her body knew what was coming before her mind would let it settle. She had been through moments like this before, moments where her entire identity collapsed into one thing, one label, one assumption, and there was nothing she could say that would outweigh what they had already decided to believe. The older officer, broad-chested with a trimmed goatee and a slight limp in his left leg, walked like he expected the world to move out of his way. The younger one, lean and sharp-jawed, kept glancing toward the church, as if hoping someone would intervene so he wouldn't have to. "Ma'am," the older officer began again, now standing less than 5 feet from her front bumper, "I asked you to step out, and I don't like repeating myself." Lenora met his eyes, her voice measured but firm. "I've already stepped out, officer. I'm here, I'm calm, and I've identified myself." "Right," he muttered, his gaze sliding down her dress, then pausing on the ID in her hand. "Dr. Grant, is it?" His voice curled slightly on the title, like it left a bitter taste in his mouth. The younger officer stepped forward, trying to insert himself between tension and consequence. "We just need to clarify some things, Dr. Grant," he said more gently. "Can you tell us what exactly you were doing in the lot?" She looked at him, not unkindly but with a gravity that made his shoulders tighten. "I was loading my car after giving a medical presentation inside the church. I'm on the church committee's speaker list. You can ask Deacon Walters or Reverend Hill." The older officer, whose name badge read, Bishop, scoffed. "Sure. And I'm the mayor of Atlanta." He turned slightly, giving a sideways glance to his partner. "People lie about being doctors all the time, especially when there's something shady going on." Lenora didn't flinch, but her pulse ticked higher at the base of her neck. She had learned long ago that escalation often came disguised as disbelief. Men like Bishop didn't raise their voices until they had already dismissed yours. "There's nothing shady here, officer. I gave my time today to talk about post-op care in low-income households. That's the truth." Bishop stepped in closer now, just a foot away, his belt grazing the side mirror. "Look, I don't know what you think this is, but we got a call about a suspicious individual near a parked SUV. A woman said she felt threatened. That's reason enough for us to investigate." Lenora's hands remained open at her sides, palms out slightly, the way she had been trained to stand during drills in medical school for how to handle violent patients. Not because she ever needed to, but because some people are threatened more by calm than by confrontation. So someone called because they felt uncomfortable seeing a black woman near a Lexus. The silence that followed was brief but undeniable. The younger officer shifted on his feet, and Bishop's eyes narrowed, not in embarrassment, but in anger at being challenged in public. "Don't play the race card," he said sharply. "We don't see color. We respond to calls." "I see," Lenora replied, her tone still steady. Well, I see color every day. In how people watch me walk through a store, in how patients ask if I'm really the surgeon, in how I'm treated right now. The tension stretched tighter like a violin string pulled past its limit, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked twice before being silenced. The sound of wind brushed through the branches overhead, scattering a few leaves down onto the asphalt. Inside the church, a hymn had begun, faint and solemn, seeping through the stained glass like a memory trying to hold on. Bishop exhaled sharply. "You're making this more difficult than it has to be. Just let us take a quick look in your car and we'll be on our way." Lenora's eyebrows rose ever so slightly, her breath catching behind her ribs. "You don't have probable cause to search my vehicle, officer. I haven't given consent, and you haven't stated a lawful reason." Bishop smiled, but it wasn't kind. It was the kind of smile that came before something mean. "Lady, you really want to go that route. We can do this by the book, or we can do it the hard way." The younger officer cleared his throat, almost a whisper. "Carl, maybe we should just—" Bishop raised a hand to cut him off. "I've got this." Lenora looked toward the chapel's entrance, hoping someone might step out, someone who could vouch for her, someone who could say her name before it disappeared beneath the static of suspicion. But no one came. The doors stayed shut, the music too distant to matter now. She looked back at the two men, her voice low but unshaken. "You need to decide what kind of report you want to write tonight. One that starts with 'officers de-escalated' or one that ends with 'detained without cause.'" Bishop took one step closer, and in that moment the line between power and ego vanished. "All right," he muttered, pulling out his radio. "We'll do it your way, for now. But don't go anywhere. We're calling it in." Lenora stepped back slightly, leaning on the edge of her trunk, her pulse still high but steady. She said nothing more because she knew what came next wasn't words. It would be judgment process, protocol, weaponized. And behind all of it, something older than the badge itself. Something she had felt since she was 12, walking through the aisles of a store in her Sunday best, while someone's mother clutched her purse just a little tighter. This was never just about today. It was about the story they thought they already knew, and the story she had to keep rewriting over and over just to be seen as real. The air felt heavier as the minutes stretched on, not just from the rising heat, but from the thickening quiet between them. A silence, not of misunderstanding, but of something being decided behind eyes that had already made up their minds. Officer Bishop walked a slow, deliberate circle around Lenora's car, his boots crunching faintly over scattered gravel, the radio on his shoulder crackling with distant chatter that didn't matter here. He stopped near her driver's side door, his hand resting just a little too close to his holster, not as a threat but as a reminder. Officer Webb stood a few feet back, arms crossed tightly, looking not at Lenora but at a spot somewhere just beyond her shoulder, as if by avoiding her gaze he might avoid responsibility for what was about to happen. Lenora kept her voice, even the kind of calm that costs something to maintain. "You still haven't told me what exactly I'm being accused of." Bishop turned to her with that same smile from before, the one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I don't need to accuse you of anything, ma'am. I gave you a lawful order and you're not cooperating." "I told you my name," she said. "I told you why I'm here. I gave you my ID. How is that not cooperation?" "You're talking back," Bishop replied, his voice tightening like a vice. "That's not cooperating. That's challenging an officer." And then, as if those words had been rehearsed, as if he'd been waiting for the moment he could act on them, he reached forward, grabbed her left wrist with unnecessary force, and spun her around toward the hood of the car. Her folder fell to the ground papers, scattering across the asphalt like a flock of startled birds. The air left her lungs in a single sharp breath, not from pain but from shock, a betrayal of every rule she'd followed, every measured choice she'd made to stay safe. Sir Webb started, his voice cracking slightly. Bishop barked, "Stay where you are," without looking back. Lenora's cheek pressed against the hot metal of her car's hood, and she could hear her own heartbeat fast and hard, like it was trying to break through her ribs. The handcuffs clicked around her wrists with practiced efficiency, but Bishop wasn't gentle. He yanked them tight, tighter than necessary, cutting into the skin above her watch. "These are too tight," she managed through gritted teeth. "I'm a surgeon. I need my hands." "Oh, you're a surgeon now," Bishop said, with a chuckle. "Should we check with the hospital or just wait for NASA to call?" Webb looked away completely now, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the stained glass window of the chapel as if hoping God himself might intervene. Lenora closed her eyes for half a second, letting the heat of the hood and the weight of the cuffs settle into her bones, not to give up, but to memorize the moment, because she knew that surviving it meant remembering it clearly. Behind her someone gasped. A low murmur moved through the edge of the parking lot where a few lingering congregants had begun to gather at a distance. No one stepped forward. Some raised their phones slowly, uncertain if recording would protect or provoke, but none moved closer. The pastor hadn't come out, the deacon hadn't intervened. Silence in these situations was always louder than it seemed. "Turn her around," Bishop ordered, and with one hand still gripping her arm, he forced Lenora upright, so she stood facing the crowd, cuffs gleaming in the sun, papers still fluttering around her feet. "This is absurd," she said, voice low but cutting. "You're arresting me based on what? A feeling, a lie, someone told because I didn't look like they expected." Bishop shrugged, guiding her by the arm toward the patrol car. "Doesn't take much, lady. Not when you mouth off. We can sort it all out downtown." The words stung, not because they surprised her, but because she had spent her entire career trying to live a life that would prevent this exact moment. Degrees awards, spotless records, charity clinics, keynote speeches, none of it could change the fact that to men like him, she was still just someone to be controlled. As they walked past the rows of parked cars, her heels clicking unevenly on the pavement, Lenora saw a young girl clutch her mother's arm tightly. The mother pulled the child behind her, whispering something Lenora couldn't hear. Another man in a blue shirt and khakis took a cautious step back, as if proximity to the scene might implicate him. None of them saw her. They saw a body in handcuffs, a narrative already shaped before a word was spoken. At the cruiser, Bishop opened the back door and gestured with a nudge. "Watch your head." Lenora didn't speak. She didn't resist, but inside, something cold and sharp began to settle where her trust used to be. As she sat down, knees together, shoulders pulled in tight to avoid the hard edge of the doorframe, her phone began to vibrate in the passenger seat of her own car just a few feet away. She couldn't reach it, couldn't see the screen, but she knew who it was. Malcolm. He would have received her message by now, and if he hadn't heard from her, he would already be moving. "Do you mind if I ask what precinct you're taking me to?" she said quietly. Bishop didn't answer. He closed the door with a firm shove, sealing her in with the heat and the smell of worn vinyl and stale air. She glanced down at her wrists. The metal had already begun to press a groove into her skin just deep enough to bruise. The cruiser didn't move right away. Bishop and Webb stood outside talking in low tones, the radio between them spitting static. She couldn't hear the words, but she recognized the body language: uncertainty, cloaked in protocol, fear wrapped in procedure. Webb looked back at her, once his face unreadable, then turned away again. And then through the glass she saw something shift in the periphery. Two black SUVs, unmarked but unmistakable in their build, and bearing turned the corner at the end of the street. Their movement was controlled, synchronized vehicles that didn't just arrive but appeared as if summoned by silence and necessity. Lenora exhaled slowly, her pulse still high but steadier now, because she knew. Whatever story they thought they were writing, whatever ending they assumed, they were about to learn that she wasn't alone in this chapter. And the next page was already turning. Malcolm Grant was slicing through the last bite of roast chicken when his phone vibrated against the oak table, its quiet buzz somehow louder than the soft jazz humming from the Bluetooth speaker tucked behind the bookshelf. Around him, the Sunday brunch for veterans was winding down, laughter blending with the clink of glassware, old friends trading stories that teetered between pride and pain. But the moment his eyes met, the screen, all warmth drained from the room. It was a message, brief and wordless, just 2 syllables he and Lenora had agreed upon months ago, the kind of signal no one else would understand. "It's time." He stood slowly, excusing himself from the table with a hand on his friend's shoulder and a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Tell the others I'll follow up next week," he said, already moving toward the door. The tone in his voice made people nod without asking questions. His suit jacket was already folded across the back seat of the SUV, and as he slid into the driver's seat, he tapped a code into the dashboard console. The engine rumbled to life, not loud, not showy, but solid, like the quiet certainty of a man who had been here before. He didn't speed. Malcolm never rushed, not even when the world tilted sideways. His hands gripped the wheel with the same stillness he'd learned years ago in covert operations, when panic was a luxury you could never afford. But beneath his calm, a storm had already begun to stir. Not the kind that exploded outward, but the kind that sharpened into something surgical, something exact. He didn't need to guess what had happened. He already knew. The moment Lenora's call didn't come through, the moment her icon froze on the GPS map just outside St. James Chapel, his training filled in the rest. It had started months ago after the third time someone followed her through a store after the HOA meeting where a neighbor suggested uniform trash bins to discourage certain types of visitors. That night, Lenora sat at the foot of their bed, silent for a long time, before saying, "We need a plan, not just prayers." So they had written messages, locations, backup contacts. Not because they were paranoid, but because history had taught them that some threats wore badges and smiles at the same time. As he approached the church's street, Malcolm slowed to a crawl eyes, scanning every angle. He saw the crowd before he saw her, the gathering of unsure witnesses, the low hum of murmured concern, and then behind the open door of a cruiser, the familiar silhouette of the woman he'd loved for over 20 years. She was seated upright, shoulders squared, hands likely still cuffed behind her. Her eyes scanned the horizon with a quiet that wasn't fear, it was calculation. He tapped the side mirror once, and from the black SUV behind him, two figures stepped out, both in civilian clothes, but unmistakable in bearing. Captain Nia Rodriguez and Lieutenant Reggie Hall, both off-duty, both loyal and both furious. They didn't speak as they walked toward him, didn't need to. The air around them changed like barometric pressure dropping before a lightning strike. Inside the cruiser, Lenora's head turned just slightly toward the street. For a moment her expression didn't change, but her chest rose deeper now, like her lungs had remembered how to breathe. She saw Malcolm's figure approach, not rushing, not shouting, just moving with a quiet precision that demanded attention without asking for it. She watched his eyes still and dark, absorbing everything without blinking, the cuffs on her wrists, the sweat on her temple, the cluster of bystanders who hadn't stepped forward. And in that glance they spoke more than words ever could. He was here, he had seen, and now everything would change. Malcolm stopped 5 feet from the cruiser and adjusted the cuff of his sleeve. His voice, when it came, was soft but carried farther than any siren. "Officers," he said, and the way he said it made both men turn before they even realized why. Inside the patrol car, Lenora closed her eyes for a second, not in surrender, but in recognition. The shift had begun, and like any skilled surgeon she knew, the first cut was always the quietest. The parking lot held its breath. A stillness had settled over the pavement, dense and waiting like the final seconds before a storm finally breaks open. The warmth of the afternoon sun still touched the tops of parked cars, casting long shadows that stretched silently across the asphalt. But the air no longer felt warm, it felt expectant. From behind the tinted windows of the cruiser, Lenora watched as the crowd shifted slightly, forming a hesitant semicircle that kept its distance yet couldn't look away. No one spoke, no one intervened. It was that kind of silence pregnant with judgment wrapped in plausible deniability, where everyone pretended they didn't see what they couldn't unsee. A woman in a church dress held her phone up chest level, not raising it high but keeping it steady, her face unsure whether she was filming out of conscience or curiosity. 2 older men, probably deacons, stood near the sidewalk, with arms folded tightly across their chests, their eyes fixed on the officers but their feet rooted to the cement. A young father kept one hand on his toddler's shoulder and the other resting anxiously on his car door, caught between parenting and witnessing something he didn't want his child to understand just yet. Inside the cruiser, Lenora's breath fogged the edge of the glass, a small crescent of condensation that faded almost as soon as it appeared. The cuffs bit harder now that her muscles had settled into stillness, and she shifted slightly, trying to relieve the pressure without drawing attention. But even the smallest movement felt like an act of resistance when you're not the one writing the story. She glanced again toward the growing group of onlookers, hoping to catch a familiar face, a nod of recognition, some gesture of shared humanity. Instead, she saw what she had seen too many times before, people unsure of what justice looks like when it wears street clothes and handcuffs. Malcolm hadn't spoken again, but his presence was doing what words never could, disrupting the narrative without raising his voice. He stood tall just outside the driver's side of the cruiser, his eyes never leaving Bishop's hands, calmly resting by his sides. The sun gleamed off the corner of his belt buckle, and the crisp line of his pressed shirt cut clean through the loose language of assumption that had formed around the scene. Rodriguez and Hall stood flanking him now, not aggressively, but unmistakably. 3 people who didn't need to shout to be heard. 3 people who had entered the lot, not as spectators, but as witnesses prepared to remember everything in perfect detail. From the edge of the crowd, a voice finally broke the silence. "Is that her husband?" someone whispered, not loud, but loud enough. Another voice replied, "I think so. He looks like somebody." And then another, "I heard he used to work in DC or something. Intelligence, maybe?" Rumors always moved faster than facts, but Lenora didn't need any of it. She just needed the truth. She needed it to be louder than their assumptions, sharper than their disbelief, stronger than the grip of that hand that had shoved her toward her own car, like she was trespassing in a life she had built brick by brick. She closed her eyes, the vinyl seat creaking beneath her as she leaned back against it, letting her spine press flat, straightening herself from the inside out. Outside, Officer Webb shifted uncomfortably, his weight moving between his feet, like a man who had just realized he might be standing on the wrong side of history. He kept looking toward Malcolm, then back at Lenora, then at the crowd, his eyes widening as more phones were raised, more people inching closer, no longer pretending to scroll through apps or wait for friends. It was harder to ignore injustice when it stood just 10 feet away, when it wore a name badge, and a smirk when it unfolded slowly in a place where the cross still hung above the door, and the word fellowship was printed on every bulletin. Bishop, however, didn't move. His jaw was set tight, his posture rigid, as if correcting it might somehow reassert control. He squinted toward Malcolm, then turned toward the cruiser, like he might open the back door and say something dismissive, something final, but stopped when he noticed Rodriguez lifting her phone not to text, but to record. Her eyes said it all. You go any further and every second of it becomes public record. It was then, only then, that Bishop stepped back, just half a step, just enough to let the moment breathe. Not because he was wrong, not because he was sorry, but because power, when truly challenged, always stutters before it crumbles. Inside the car, Lenora caught her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her eyes met themselves, and for the first time in the past hour, she allowed the mask to slip just slightly, not to cry, not to break, just to remember the weight of what was happening, to feel it without apology. She thought of the young interns she mentored at the hospital, the ones who whispered about what it meant to make it, who looked at her as if excellence could somehow inoculate them against moments like these. She wanted to believe it too. But now, seated in the back of a police car surrounded by a silent audience and a husband who had turned a rival into resistance, she saw clearly what she had always known. Deep down, even the highest titles didn't always grant you the benefit of the doubt. The crowd shifted again as murmurs rippled through the silence, and Lenora leaned forward slightly, watching through the windshield as a new vehicle turned the corner, sleek, official, unmistakably city-issued. She recognized the emblem before she even read the license plate. The chief had arrived, and with him came the next reckoning. The arrival of the unmarked city vehicle sent a subtle ripple through the parking lot like a breeze, before a thunderclap soft but unmistakably charged. The emblem on the side door glinted briefly in the sun as the car slowed to a halt, its wheels settling with a hushed sigh of rubber against asphalt. Everything else seemed to pause. In response, the crowd quieted to a hum. The murmurs fell back into breath, and even the birds in the trees above went still, as if they too sensed something consequential had entered the space. Malcolm didn't flinch, didn't look away from the officers still standing beside his wife's cruiser, but his hands loosely clasped at his waist, straightened slightly, a silent acknowledgement that the stage had shifted once again. The driver's door opened with calm precision, and from it emerged a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, his salt and pepper hair cropped neatly at the sides, his dark blue uniform pressed to military sharpness. Chief Harold Denning wasn't the kind of man who needed to speak first to establish presence. His silence was a signal in itself, a statement that he'd come not just to observe, but to contain. His eyes, narrow and alert beneath deep-set brows, scanned the scene with a kind of weariness, earned not just through years of service, but from seeing this exact moment, this exact fracture, repeat itself across too many neighborhoods, with too many names and always the same silence in the aftermath. Chief Malcolm said evenly, his voice carrying just enough weight to draw focus without demanding it. "I assume you've been briefed." Denning gave the smallest of nods, his eyes not yet meeting Malcolm's, instead drifting first toward the cruiser, where Lenora sat cuffed in the back seat. He took one step closer, exhaled slowly, and finally spoke, not loudly, but with a tone that demanded listening. "Colonel Grant, I didn't expect to see you here today." "You didn't expect my wife to be arrested in a church parking lot either," Malcolm replied, his gaze steady but not combative. "And yet here we are." For a moment, neither man moved. The sound of distant traffic filtered through the oaks lining the edge of the lot, and somewhere in the background, a church bell began to toll again, each ring spaced like a countdown. Denning finally turned to the two officers, Bishop and Webb, who now stood at full attention, their faces tense, their mouths tight with the weight of their own decisions. The chief walked toward them slowly, his footsteps deliberate, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots loud in the stillness. "Officers," Denning said, his voice low and clipped, "you want to walk me through this?" Bishop cleared his throat, but the words didn't come easily. "We received a call about suspicious activity near a vehicle, possible attempted theft. We made contact with the subject. She refused to comply at first, so I placed her in restraints for safety while we investigated." Denning raised an eyebrow. "Subject," Bishop hesitated. "Dr. Lenora Grant, sir." She identified herself. "Claimed she was doing a medical presentation at the church," claimed Denning repeated. "Did anyone confirm that before you put her in cuffs?" "No, sir." Webb interjected, his voice noticeably quieter. "But she didn't escalate, there was no violence. I thought maybe we could just—" "Did she resist?" Denning asked, cutting to the center like a scalpel. Webb looked down. "No, sir." Denning inhaled slowly, then turned his body slightly as if positioning himself for the crowd to see. "Did she pose a threat?" "No, sir," Webb admitted, and Bishop didn't speak again. There was a beat of silence before Denning looked toward Lenora's vehicle. "Uncuff her," he said. "Now." Webb moved first, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the keys with fingers that trembled just enough to be noticed. As he opened the rear door, Lenora stepped out slowly, her movements careful but unbroken, like someone standing after being underwater too long. Her wrists were red, faint marks, already beginning to bloom like bruised petals along the skin, but her expression remained unreadable, somewhere between grace and restraint, not out of forgiveness but survival. "Dr. Grant Denning," said as she faced him on behalf of this department, "I apologize for what's taken place here today." Lenora didn't blink. "Are you apologizing for your officers?" she asked, her voice quiet and composed. "Or for the system that lets this happen again and again?" Denning's mouth opened, then closed. For once, he didn't have a rehearsed response. Malcolm stepped forward, placing a steady hand at the small of Lenora's back, not to protect her, but to remind her she wasn't alone. "Chief," he said, "my wife has surgeries scheduled today. Lives depending on her hands your department saw fit to restrain without cause. You tell me how we explain that." Denning looked from Malcolm to Lenora and then beyond them both to the phones still held at chest level by half the crowd. He knew this wouldn't be confined to today's paperwork. He knew this moment would outlive everyone standing in that lot. And somewhere in his posture, the first traces of reckoning began to show, not with the noise of resistance, but with the stillness of exposure. As the chief turned to give instructions to his aide, Lenora walked slowly back to her car, Malcolm by her side, Rodriguez and Hall following just a step behind. The crowd parted without a word. No one dared to meet her eyes. She didn't need them to. She had her own story now, and this time they would all hear it. The moment the handcuffs clicked open, something shifted in the air, subtle but unmistakable, like pressure lifting after a storm, leaving behind a different kind of quiet. Lenora didn't speak right away. She simply brought her wrists together in front of her, rubbing the raw, reddened skin with the slow, controlled movements of someone trained to understand trauma even as it was happening to her. Her fingers moved with clinical care like she was tending to someone else's injuries, not her own. Malcolm stood at her side, close but not crowding her, watching with a soldier's stillness that made even bystanders take a half step back without realizing why. Rodriguez and Hall remained in place behind them, not posturing, not saying a word, just existing like a wall the moment could not pass through. Chief Denning had ordered the cuffs removed, had offered a formal apology, and had turned away quickly after speaking into his radio with clipped efficiency, trying to restore a sense of control that had already been lost. But Lenora knew better than to mistake silence for resolution or protocol for accountability. She had spent years listening to surgeons explain away mistakes as unfortunate anomalies, watching systems protect reputations over patients. What had just happened to her was no anomaly. It was a design feature. One everyone had learned to tolerate as background noise until it became a spectacle they could no longer ignore. "Are you hurt?" Malcolm asked, his voice low-measured, carrying the softness of concern buried beneath layers of restraint. "I'll be fine," Lenora replied, though her voice carried a tightness that hadn't been there before, as if she had to choose between clarity and composure. "They didn't break anything, just left a mark." Malcolm nodded his eyes, scanning her wrists again, then lifting toward the crowd which had started to dissipate in slow waves, some people turning away with guilt in their gait, others clinging to their phones like relics of a moment they couldn't quite process. One man muttered something under his breath as he passed, but no one acknowledged it. Denial often traveled in whispers. Chief Denning returned a folder now in his hand, and approached with the cautious diplomacy of someone who understood that this was no longer just a situation, it was a story. "Dr. Grant, I'd like to speak privately," he said, nodding toward a quieter area near the edge of the lot where a row of parked cars offered the illusion of privacy. Lenora didn't move. "With all due respect, Chief, I think it's better we speak here." In full view, Denning paused, then gave a tight nod. "As you prefer." Malcolm didn't say anything, but his presence felt like punctuation at the end of every sentence, firm, final, and unignorable. Lenora squared her shoulders and looked the chief directly in the eye. "Before you speak, I want to ask something. When your officers heard the words black woman, nice car, and suspicious, what part of that equation justified immediate restraint?" Denning exhaled, slow and visible. "It didn't," he said. "I won't defend that. I can't." Lenora nodded once, a small gesture, not of agreement but acknowledgement. "Then I'll ask again later. And not just you, the city, the department, the community that let this grow under their nose until it touched someone too visible to disappear quietly." Behind them, Hall's phone buzzed once, and he glanced down quickly, eyes narrowing. He leaned toward Malcolm and whispered, "It's already online." Someone posted the whole encounter. Multiple angles. Over 60,000 views in 15 minutes. Malcolm didn't react outwardly, but the corner of his mouth tensed slightly. "Let it spread," he said. "Sunlight's the only thing that sterilizes this." A new silence fell different this time, not the awkward hush of disbelief, but the kind of stillness that comes when people begin to realize they've witnessed a shift, that the rules they'd quietly accepted might no longer hold. And for some that was terrifying. Denning cleared his throat and gestured to Rodriguez. "I'll need full incident reports from everyone present. Captain Rodriguez, Lieutenant Hall. You two were present as federal observers. I'd like your statements sent to my office by end of day." Rodriguez arched an eyebrow. "We're not here as observers, Chief. We're here because Colonel Grant contacted us directly. We accompanied him of our own accord." Hall nodded. "And I'm documenting everything," he added calmly. "That includes the part where your officer used force before confirming any details. You might want to request the church security footage before it gets subpoenaed." Denning's eyes darkened for a fraction of a second, but he caught himself. Understood. A pause stretched again, then Lenora turned slightly toward Malcolm. "I need to get to the hospital," she said. "They have a 16-year-old on my surgery board with a subdural bleed. If I'm not there in an hour, he may not survive." "Then we move," Malcolm said. He turned back to Denning. "You want to make this right. Escort her, publicly. Same car, same officers. Let everyone see who she is now and who they were to her then. Denning hesitated. That's not procedure. Malcolm's gaze didn't flinch. Neither was today. The chief turned slowly to Bishop and Webb, who still stood by the cruiser like ghosts of their former authority. "Officers," he said, voice cool. "Dr. Grant requires a priority escort to Mercy General. Lights on. No delays." Webb paled. "Sir, with respect." "That's an order." Denning cut in sharper now. Lenora walked toward the cruiser again, but this time she opened the back door herself, then paused. "No," she said. "Front seat. I'm not a detainee. I'm a doctor." Webb swallowed hard, then nodded, unlocking the front door with fumbling fingers. She slid in composed chin, high eyes forward. Malcolm leaned in before she closed the door. "I'll meet you at the hospital," he said. "And then we start building the rest of this case." As the cruiser pulled away, sirens cutting clear through the afternoon air, Malcolm remained in place, watching until the vehicle disappeared behind the trees lining the road. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to, because what began in silence was now echoing louder than anyone could stop. The cruiser moved through the streets with its lights flashing a ripple of blue cutting through the late afternoon traffic, clearing a path that moments earlier had been indifferent to the urgency of one woman's presence. Lenora sat upright in the front passenger seat, hands folded neatly in her lap, the imprint of the cuffs still faintly visible against her skin, though her mind had already moved past the pain. Her posture was composed, but unyielding, her gaze fixed ahead, as if the road in front of her offered not just distance to be covered, but truth to be reclaimed. Officer Webb gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles pale, saying nothing, as the city blurred by his window, its sidewalks, its storefronts, its people, all witnesses now, whether they knew it or not. Inside the vehicle, the silence was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic whoop of the siren, echoing off glass and brick. Lenora felt the hum of the engine in her feet, a subtle vibration that mirrored the energy rising in her chest, not adrenaline, not fear, but something older and harder to define. It was the quiet certainty of a woman who had nothing left to explain. She didn't look at Webb, but she could sense his discomfort in the way he adjusted the volume of the radio, the way he glanced at her reflection in the mirror, and quickly looked away. She didn't want an apology. She didn't want regret. What she wanted, what she demanded, was change. They reached the hospital in under 9 minutes. The cruiser slid into the emergency bay just as the trauma team was opening the doors. Lenora was already unbuckling before the car came to a full stop, her white coat in her arms pulled hastily from her briefcase on the floor. She stepped out with purpose, not with haste, her heels clicking across the pavement like punctuation marks on a page, no longer being written by anyone else's hand. A nurse rushed to her with a tablet, eyes wide but respectful. "We've prepped OR2. CT confirms pressure from the bleed. Neuroteam's waiting." Lenora nodded, slipping on her coat in one fluid motion, the fabric falling around her shoulders like armor. "Vitals?" she asked, already scanning the chart. "BP's dropping, ICP climbing, teenager right." "Yes, ma'am," the nurse said, falling into step. 16. Name's Daniel Alvarez. High school football player. Head injury during practice. Page Dr. Ng for backup, just in case, Lenora said, and make sure we have a transfusion unit standing by. As they moved through the automatic doors and into the brightly lit corridor, Webb stood awkwardly at the edge of the entrance, unsure if he should follow, speak, or simply disappear. He looked around, but no one was paying attention to him anymore. Everyone was watching her. And for the first time he saw her not as a woman in a sweatshirt or a subject in a report, but as a leader, a healer, a force that moved through the world with clarity and purpose no badge could imitate. Lenora entered the OR like she had 100 times before, but today it felt different, heavier, sharper, more exposed. Her hands trembled slightly as she washed, not from doubt, but from the friction of rage still moving through her blood. She looked at them under the faucet, the water running clear now, but in her mind, she still saw the steel cuffs clamped too tight, still felt the way her body had been pushed and dismissed, like a name stripped of meaning. And yet she exhaled, steadying herself, pressing her fingertips together until the tremor stopped. Inside the OR, her team awaited her like they always did, focused, respectful, competent. But there was something extra in their eyes today, something unspoken. They had seen the footage, they had read the texts, they had watched their chief neurosurgeon be treated like a criminal on the very day she was supposed to save a life. "Scalpel," Lenora said, and the tool was placed in her hand without delay. The surgery began. Outside in the waiting area, Malcolm sat with a straight back and folded hands, his phone silent now, but his mind still moving in every direction. He had already spoken to the family. He had assured them she was the best. He had made 3 calls, one to Elijah Washington, the civil rights attorney they trusted, one to Zoe Carter, the investigative journalist already building the case, and one to Rodriguez, to begin compiling every name, every document, every inch of footage. He didn't pace. He didn't vent. Instead, he read the officer's report on his tablet line by line, making notes with a stylus, marking inconsistencies, highlighting language that shifted blame in the passive voice. Subject was non-compliant, became. Subject questioned the rationale for restraint. Routine inquiry became unspecified, report by unnamed civilian. It was a language of erasure, and he had spent enough of his career decoding it to know exactly how to expose it. An hour passed. Then another. Finally, the double doors opened and Lenora stepped into the corridor again, her gloves off, her mask tucked under her chin. Her face was flushed from exertion, but her expression was calm, precise, resolved. "He's stable," she said to the boy's parents, who rose in unison. "The pressure's down. He's not out of the woods yet, but we've bought him time and hope." Tears followed quickly, but she accepted them quietly, as she always did. Not as praise, but as confirmation that she had done what she was called to do despite everything. Malcolm stood slowly as she approached. "You good?" he asked gently, his voice deeper now, lower with quiet pride. She nodded. "I did what needed doing, both inside and out." As they walked back toward her office, Lenora passed a group of nurses at the station. One of them, a young black woman just beginning her residency, looked up and said softly, "They'll never see us the same again, will they?" Lenora paused, met her eyes, and answered, "Number." And that's exactly the point. By the time Lenora returned to her office, the hospital hallways had quieted into their late afternoon rhythm. Soft footsteps muted overhead pages, the occasional creak of a cart wheeling down the corridor with purposeful silence. She closed the door behind her gently, not with exhaustion, but with the deliberate calm of someone compartmentalizing someone who needed the next room to feel different from the one before. The lights were dim, the sun filtering through the blinds in long gold stripes that stretched across her bookshelf and medical diplomas, the same ones she'd once believed would be armor. She removed her coat, slowly folding it over the back of her chair, then sat down with her hands resting in her lap, bruised wrists turned palm up like they were still waiting to be read. Across the room, Malcolm was already there, his laptop open on the table, 2 folders beside it, one marked legal and the other unironically truth. He didn't look up immediately, his fingers gliding across the keyboard with practiced rhythm, but when he did, his gaze met hers with a quiet that was somehow louder than comfort. "I pulled the precinct's incident report," he said, voice low. "It's already been filed. Language is sanitized, passive verbs, vague timelines, 0 mention of your title." Lenora nodded slowly, unsurprised. "Let me guess, subject was observed acting suspiciously near a civilian vehicle, followed by officers acted within departmental protocol pending verification." He almost smiled, almost word for word. They sat in that silence for a beat, the kind shared only by people who had run out of illusions but not out of energy. Then Malcolm clicked something on his screen and turned it toward her. "This is the church's security footage." Rodriguez pulled it straight from the on-site system. "No edits, clean audio. It shows you walking to your car, standing for 37 seconds, then being approached." She watched the screen without blinking. "Did I touch anything other than my keys?" "Nothing," Malcolm said. "Not even your phone until Bishop barked at you." There was no satisfaction in being proven right, only confirmation of how thin the line had always been. Thin enough to trip over, thick enough to strangle. Lenora leaned back slightly in her chair, fingertips pressed together in a triangle under her chin, watching the woman on screen go through the motions, calm, polite, dignified, and still wind up in cuffs. "Upload it to the drive," she said softly. and label it pretext. Outside the office, a knock came light but deliberate. Malcolm stood to answer, revealing Elijah Washington on the other side, wearing his usual gray suit and expression like he'd walked straight out of a courtroom deposition. He entered the room with a nod and dropped a tablet on the desk between them. "You're going to want to see this," he said. "It's the raw body cam footage." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "They released it already." "They didn't," Elijah said, settling into the chair across from Lenora. "This was leaked anonymously to a friend of mine in City Legal. He forwarded it to me an hour ago." Lenora tapped the screen to play, and the grainy footage began. Officer Bishop's chest-mounted view, the distorted angle of the lot, the aggressive tone sharpened by digital static. She watched herself try to explain, watched him dismiss her words, watched Webb hesitate, then disappear behind the frame when things turned physical. She watched it all with the same composure she used in surgery, steady breath, no wasted motion, but Malcolm saw her thumb curl under her palm, pressing hard against skin that hadn't fully healed. When the handcuffs clicked on screen, Elijah paused the footage and zoomed slightly. You hear that he asked, tapping the audio waveform. That's when she says, "I need my hands," and he laughs. "That right there is what I'll be using." Lenora looked at him. "Will it hold up?" "It'll do more than hold," Elijah said, tapping the screen again. "Especially when paired with witness statements." He slid a manila folder across the table. 6 churchgoers have come forward, all with written affidavits. One recorded a video starts right after they cuffed you. That's already gone viral. 500,000 views in 5 hours. She opened the folder slowly, reading the first few lines of each statement, like they were variations on a song she knew by heart. She wasn't yelling. She didn't resist. "I was too afraid to say anything, and now I regret it." Each one a mirror. Each one proof. "I'll add this to my grand jury package," Elijah said. "It's no longer just about misconduct, it's a civil rights violation and possibly even assault under state code." The room fell into a deeper quiet, then one lined with the gravity of what was unfolding. This wasn't just a personal reckoning anymore, it was structural, a chain reaction already in motion. Malcolm opened the second folder labeled Truth and pulled out a spreadsheet. "We're building a timeline," he said. "Not just of that day, but of the last 6 months, every incident, every call, every ignored report from neighbors. Webb and Bishop have been involved in at least 4 other questionable stops in the same area, always Black or Latino residents, always dismissed." Lenora looked at the names on the list, some familiar, some not, but all echoing the same pattern. "This isn't about bias," she said. "This is a system preserving itself. Predictable, rehearsed, refined." Malcolm nodded. "And we're going to show it. Frame by frame. Word by word." Elijah closed his tablet and stood. "I'll be in touch tomorrow with the court filing plan. For now, rest. This part's done." As he left the room, exhaled again. The sun outside had shifted, casting longer shadows across the blinds, gold turning to rust light, becoming memory. Lenora stood and walked slowly toward the window, arms crossed, not in defense but in grounding. Below, she could see a group of interns gathering near the sidewalk, laughing heads bent together in that casual, careless joy she remembered having once. One of them pointed toward the building, maybe at her window, maybe not, but in that moment she didn't look away. Because she knew they were watching, and that mattered more than anything, because this time someone had to. By the end of the week, the story had breached the boundaries of local concern and spilled into something larger, something national, something raw. Headlines bloomed across news sites like bruises, neurosurgeon, detained in parking lot, chief of surgery, mistaken for suspect, church surveillance reveals, racial bias in arrest. The videos had been shared millions of times, dissected by analysts, debated on morning shows, clipped into 30-second TikToks and 12-minute breakdowns by legal YouTubers who paused every frame as if justice could be measured pixel by pixel. But for Lenora and Malcolm, the noise outside wasn't the battle they'd expected that part. What mattered now was the architecture beneath it, all the scaffolding of silence and self-preservation that had allowed this moment to happen, not by mistake, but by design. At home, Lenora sat at the kitchen table, dressed down in a soft navy sweater, her reading glasses balanced on her nose, reviewing a draft of her statement for the upcoming town hall. The page in front of her was already marked with revisions. Words she'd softened, others she'd sharpened, balancing truth with tact in the way only someone who'd lived between two worlds could do. Malcolm paced quietly nearby on speakerphone with Elijah discussing the timeline for public testimony and discovery requests. The dishwasher hummed in the background, and somewhere outside a lawnmower droned like a distant warning normalcy, pushing itself back into a space that no longer fit. "They're going to push back hard," Malcolm said, covering the phone for a moment. "Department's already floating a counter-narrative, claiming the call they got described you as agitated, possibly under the influence." Lenora looked up slowly, not angry but unsurprised. "Of course they are," she said, "because a black woman being confident always looks like aggression if you don't think she belongs there." She turned back to her notes, voice steady. "Let them try. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here for record." That night, the mayor's office confirmed the town hall would move forward as planned with an open microphone segment that guaranteed public response. The forum would be held at the local civic center neutral ground, large enough for media and citizens alike, small enough that no one could hide behind the room. Lenora stood backstage in a charcoal blazer, palms pressed together in front of her like she did before surgery. Her words memorized, but her message deeper than anything written on paper. Malcolm stood beside her, whispering a last reminder. "Speak slow. Breathe between sentences. Silence can carry weight, too." "I know," she replied, her lips forming a half-smile. "It already has." When they called her name, the room hushed into a stillness that felt not like respect, but reckoning. She stepped forward with the measured grace of someone who had learned long ago that entering a space wasn't just physical, it was political. Her heels tapped 3 even beats on the wooden floor before she reached the podium, and when she looked up, she didn't just see faces, she saw questions, fear, hope, doubt, familiarity. She began not with anger but with memory. "My name is Dr. Lenora Grant," she said, voice clear, microphone adjusted just slightly to match her height. "I'm chief of neurosurgery at Mercy General, a mother, a wife, a neighbor, and on Sunday I was handcuffed in front of your church." Gasps rippled, quiet but sharp. "I was accused without evidence, restrained without resistance, and humiliated without cause. Not because I was guilty, but because I was present." She let the silence settle again, not to guilt them, but to let them listen. "I want you to ask yourself, how many times have you seen someone like me and decided what they must be before you ever asked who they actually are? How many times have you stayed quiet hoping someone else would step forward first?" She paused, eyes scanning the room, not with challenge but with clarity. "I'm not here to destroy anyone's career. I'm here to dismantle a pattern, one that makes dignity conditional and power unaccountable." At the end of her speech, no one clapped at first. Not because they disagreed, but because applause felt too small. Then slowly, deliberately, someone stood. Then another. Then the room. Not roaring, not weeping, just standing. Not for what had happened, but for what would no longer be ignored. Afterward, back in the parking lot, a woman in her 70s approached Lenora, slowly wearing a gray coat and a quiet, almost hesitant smile. "I was there," she said softly. "I saw them put their hands on you and I didn't say a word." Lenora looked at her, eyes soft. "Thank you for saying something now. I wish I'd had the courage earlier." "You do now. That matters more than you think." Meanwhile, Elijah had begun assembling the official complaint, complete with every time-stamped video, every statement, every discrepancy in the officer's reports. Rodriguez submitted her testimony under oath, and Hall provided a written statement documenting the moments Denning hesitated the orders given the language used. The case had outgrown its origin. It was no longer just about Lenora. It was about policy, pattern, precedent. Late that night, as Lenora sat curled on the couch, blanket pulled to her chin, Malcolm handed her a tablet. "You need to see this," he said quietly. It was a letter shared publicly by the hospital's board, condemning the treatment she had endured and affirming their support for her leadership and personhood, signed by every department head, shared with every staff member, framed not as PR but as principle. Lenora read it once, then again, and finally set it aside. "It's not justice," she said quietly. "No," Malcolm agreed. "But it's a beginning." And beginnings, they both knew, were rare and sacred things, especially when they came from fire, especially when they refused to fade. In the days that followed the town hall, the rhythm of life resumed, but it didn't return untouched. Something in the city's atmosphere had shifted like a lingering echo that refused to fade into the background noise. Lenora noticed it first in the subtle things, the way security guards at the hospital now nodded with more intention, the way strangers paused a second longer before speaking as if reconsidering how their assumptions might shape their tone. Her presence had not only been acknowledged, it had been recalibrated, not through fear or fame, but through the quiet power of truth spoken plainly without apology. She moved through the hospital corridors with the same purposeful steps as always, but now her walk drew whispers from interns, nods from residents, brief moments of eye contact from colleagues who previously passed too quickly to engage. She didn't bask in it, didn't want it, but she accepted it as a sign that the story had done what stories are supposed to do: reveal what had been hidden, give shape to what was previously denied, force people to reckon with what they could no longer unsee. One afternoon, while reviewing surgical rotations in her office, a knock came soft, unsure. She looked up to find a first-year resident, a young Filipino woman named Amy, shifting nervously in the doorway. "Dr. Grant," she said, voice trembling slightly. "Can I ask you something personal?" Lenora smiled gently, setting down her pen. "Of course. How do you stay calm when it's obvious they're waiting for you to slip?" There was a pause longer than either of them expected. "I don't stay calm," Lenora said finally. "I stay grounded. There's a difference. Calm is what they demand of you. Grounded is what you claim for yourself." Amy nodded, eyes welling, but not from sadness, from recognition. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Moments like that had begun to ripple outward. Across town, local clergy had launched a coalition dedicated to addressing racial profiling in places of worship and community centers, using Lenora's experience as a catalyst. Schools added workshops for educators on implicit bias. Even the city council, long resistant to controversial oversight measures, passed a motion to review all body cam footage within 48 hours of a complaint, something Malcolm had pushed for years ago when no one listened. Malcolm himself had grown quieter, more focused. His military background kicked into gear, not in tactics but in logistics. He compiled timelines, studied case law, drafted proposals for systemic oversight mechanisms that could live beyond the media cycle. Some nights Lenora found him in his study at midnight, papers spread across the floor like a battlefield, his face lined with thought. "Are you trying to solve the whole country before sunrise?" she teased one evening, leaning on the doorframe in her robe. He didn't look up immediately, then smiled just enough to soften his exhaustion. "Only the parts that keep trying to erase you." She walked in, pressed her cheek gently to the top of his head. "Then we worked together." The legal case began to evolve faster than expected. After public pressure and internal division within the department, Officer Webb requested a private meeting with Elijah Washington. Within days, an affidavit was filed, his statement confirming that he had never felt threatened by Lenora, that Officer Bishop had escalated unnecessarily, and that, in his words, "we were responding more to appearance than action." It wasn't redemption, but it was a fracture in the wall. Bishop, on the other hand, doubled down, hired a lawyer, went on conservative talk shows, painted himself as a casualty of cancel culture. But his record had already unraveled under scrutiny: 6 misconduct complaints over 4 years, 3 settled quietly, 2 still pending. Public sentiment shifted quickly. Accountability no longer looked like punishment, it looked like necessary recalibration. At the hospital, Lenora launched a mentorship program for medical students of color, not just to guide their academic growth, but to create a space where they could name what they had been taught to endure silently. In their first meeting, she didn't give them rules, she gave them stories. Stories of what it meant to navigate spaces where credentials didn't insulate you, where composure was demanded but rarely reciprocated, where you had to carry excellence like a shield even when it was heavy. Meanwhile, Zoe Carter, the journalist who had quietly documented every phase of Lenora's journey, published a long-form investigative piece titled "Not Just One Woman: What the Arrest of Dr. Lenora Grant Revealed About Structural Power." The article went viral for reasons neither Lenora nor Malcolm had anticipated, not because of its drama, but because of its restraint. It didn't sensationalize, it explained. It laid out patterns, It made the invisible architecture of bias visible to those who hadn't known it was there. One evening, as the sun set behind their house, casting soft gold across the kitchen floor, Malcolm poured Lenora a glass of tea and handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Someone dropped this off at the front desk," he said. No name. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a thin, hand-bound journal. On the cover, in neat pen, were the words, "I saw you. I didn't know what to say, but I'm learning." She stared at it for a moment, then closed the cover gently, hands still resting on the surface. "We're not done," she said quietly. "No," Malcolm replied, placing his hand over hers. "But for once they're listening." And in that moment, bathed in amber light, held not by apology but by awareness, she believed that maybe, just maybe, something would last. It was nearly dusk when Lenora stepped into the quiet of her home office, the light outside fading into the soft gray blue that precedes night. The walls held the warmth of early spring windows open just enough to let in the sounds of a settling neighborhood, distant laughter, a dog barking, the low hum of a passing car. But inside, the air felt still, like something sacred had just happened and needed space to breathe. On her desk lay the journal, the one with the handwritten note. "I saw you. I didn't know what to say, but I'm learning." She placed a new letter beside it, one that had arrived that morning. It was from a retired schoolteacher who had watched the entire story unfold from beginning to end. "You reminded me of the students I never defended loud enough," it read. "Thank you for showing us how to be better even when you didn't have to." Lenora traced the edges of the envelope with her finger. She didn't need the validation, but she recognized the shift, the quiet turning of a tide that began not with outrage but with reflection. Change, she had come to believe, didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered in private moments, in handwritten notes, in eyes that no longer looked away. Downstairs, Malcolm was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup while soft jazz played low on the speaker. He looked up as she entered, nodding in that familiar way that needed no words. She walked over, leaned against the counter beside him, and exhaled the kind of breath that only comes after something heavy has begun to lift. "They closed the internal review," he said. "Final decision, policy violations confirmed. Bishop's badge revoked. Permanent record. No appeal." She nodded once slowly. "Not justice," she said. "But it's something. It's a beginning," he agreed. They ate dinner quietly that evening, not out of exhaustion but out of mutual peace. The storm had passed, not forgotten, not undone, but passed. And now came the part no one prepares you for living beyond the moment you never asked for. Later that night, as the city settled into sleep, Lenora sat once more at her desk, pen in hand. She began drafting a message to the medical students in her mentorship group, something not about her experience but about theirs. She wrote of excellence not as defense but as contribution, of belonging not as permission but as inheritance, and of the power of standing still in the face of harm, not out of fear, but because your name is worth anchoring to the ground. She paused midway through, looking out the window, watching the wind brush through the trees under the moonlight. The same trees that once stood still as she was cuffed in front of them, now swayed gently like witnesses remembering. And maybe she thought that's all justice, is sometimes making sure the things that watched us break also see us heal. When she finally stood to go to bed, Malcolm was already asleep, one hand resting on the empty side of the mattress, his breathing even. She climbed in quietly, turned off the bedside lamp, and let the darkness surround her not as a threat but as rest. Before her eyes closed, she whispered something she hadn't said aloud in days, something that wasn't about courtrooms or headlines or consequence. "I'm still here." And this time no one could take that away.